Lawmakers are looking at ways to regulate social media platforms to combat misinformation. Many critics say these platforms have caused extremist groups to grow and played a role in inciting the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. The CEOs of Twitter, Facebook, and Google deny their platforms are solely responsible for the spread of misinformation, but both Democrats and Republicans say major change is needed. For more on this, I'm joined by Jonathan Peters. He's an associate professor at the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. He's also an affiliate professor at the university's School of Law. So, Jonathan, during a House committee hearing last month, several lawmakers told the CEOs of Google, Facebook, and Twitter that self-regulation was not working. What has self-regulation looked like, and what are some of the ways that we could see government become more involved?
If we look at this through the lens of content moderation, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media companies are non-governmental entities, and that means that they have First Amendment rights generally to create and enforce their own rules regarding user content. The platforms can decide what kind of content can be posted, under what conditions to remove it, how to display and prioritize it, and when to suspend or deactivate user accounts. These are extraordinary powers because of the enormous number of people who routinely use social media to communicate and to receive news. And that is increasingly making social media companies attractive targets for regulators and legislators. Historically, the web and social media space have been very lightly regulated, and that has been by design. The web was conceived in an ethos of cyber libertarianism on the theory that this is an environment in which the government should play at most a minimal role. But that's very much an issue right now in regulatory agencies and legislative bodies around the country that are considering efforts to restrict how social media companies moderate content and otherwise how they behave, including measures that would reform Section 230.
Yeah, so since you mentioned Section 230, we've heard from both Democrats and Republicans about the possibility of reforming that section of the Communications Decency Act. Remind our viewers how this provision impacts big tech companies. We know why it was put in place initially, and we know that some of the problems that have come out of it. So remind us all what the next likely steps could be.
So among other things, it says that internet intermediaries, including social media companies that host user content, are generally not responsible for liability arising out of that user content. So if you posted something on Facebook that defamed another person and she sued over it, the claim would lie against you and not against Facebook. And beyond that, a scenario in which a platform can avoid liability for hosting user content, it can also avoid liability for taking down user content that the platform finds objectionable for some reason. That makes Section 230 something of a shield and a sword. And that kind of legal immunity was meant to protect the internet as a forum for diverse views and to protect the innovation occurring on the web, where in the mid-90s, when the Communications Decency Act was enacted, sites were becoming more and more interactive. And Section 230 was also meant to encourage sites and users to self-police extreme and harmful content. Right now, though, the growing chorus is that Section 230 should be reformed. The problem is that Democrats and Republicans can't agree on what the root issue is. Democrats argue broadly that social media platforms allow too much harmful user content to be posted and spread. Disinformation and hate speech would be good examples, while Republicans focus more on their belief that the platforms engage in viewpoint discrimination against conservatives. What is key in all of this, though, is that Section 230 is not constitutionally guaranteed. It comes from Congress in a statute, so Congress can take it away or modify it.
That's a very good point, because sometimes we hear people conflate freedom of speech with conversations that are taking place on the internet, and the two are not necessarily the same. And Jonathan, as I mentioned earlier, critics have blamed the January 6th attack in part on tech companies due to the spread of misinformation and falsehoods on their platforms. Have the events of that day created a sense of urgency among lawmakers to overhaul tech?
I think the insurrection put into stark relief the consequences of misinformation and disinformation, and the decisions by various companies to suspend or block President Trump's accounts put into stark relief the power that the companies have. But again, this is not really a new phenomenon. Scholars and others have been writing about content moderation practices and policies for over 15 years at this point, and questioning critically how and why the companies behave as they do, and proposing reforms along the way. But I think that few events have cast a brighter light on so many of the underlying issues as the January insurrection did.
All right. Jonathan Peters, thank you.
Thank you.